What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a great day today. This is Alex from the Fresh Fantasy Podcast, and this is the 31st episode of Season 3. Today, we're going to be talking about 10 questions all over Fantasyland. Guys, we're excited about, worried about, breaking down certain players that fantasy managers are having tough times with their drafts, as well as a couple of debates. Joining me to break down all of this today is a man who has been taking over the fantasy football industry the last 2 years. He's the owner of a Discord with almost 800 monthly subscribers. He is considered the grand master of fantasy football threads, an accountant by day, fighting fantasy crime by night, a great friend of mine, and one of the smartest fantasy football minds that I have ever seen. With over 16,000 followers on Twitter, he is the one, the only, Bulletproof's Drew Osinchuck. Welcome back.
Thanks, man. Good to be back.
No, absolutely. I'm always excited to talk fantasy with you and talk about the Bulletproof process and everything that we have going on like that. So I'm really excited to get into that today. We'll start with you with a question because we're getting into training camp now, and there's all kinds of different hype going on and training camp reports, and people are starting to get excited. So with that being said, who is one player in general that you were just really excited about this year? I know this is a broad question, but someone that you just cannot stop thinking about or talking about come fantasy draft season.
I think it has to be DJ Moore. He is someone that I've been on in the past and kind of always just like a let's hope chaos breaks through, because his quarterbacks have always been pretty bad, all things considered. And this is the first year that I can recall in his history where I'm like, actually, the quarterback might be a positive here, which is probably a bit of a hot take, which is maybe the answer I should have given you is who am I higher on than most, is the Baker Mayfield DJ Moore connection, because Baker Mayfield has been at worst mediocre on a per play basis since entering the NFL. And the quarterbacks that DJ Moore has played with up until this point of his career have been atrocious on a per play basis, other than Teddy Bridgewater, who was okay at throwing footballs, but not in the red zone. Teddy Bridgewater did not throw touchdowns. He's never thrown touchdowns at any point in his entire life. Baker Mayfield is a touchdown thrower. He averages a 4.8% touchdown rate over his entire career, which is like double what the touchdown rate has been in Carolina since DJ Moore has entered the NFL.
Wow.
So DJ Moore has always been a very good fantasy producer despite not scoring touchdowns. This is the year where I actually feel like, hey, the range of outcomes here is that he likely will score touchdowns, not like, while we don't really know anything can happen, he could score touchdowns. This year I'm thinking, or I'm projecting him to score touchdowns, which is something I've never done in the past. So it's very, very exciting. This is DJ Moore's had like the last 3 years, I believe it's been 1,200 yards or thereabouts on a per game basis. Now he gets the best quarterback of his life that actually throws touchdown passes. We could be talking about a 1,300 yard, 1,400 yard player that scores 8-9 touchdowns. And he's not being drafted. Like, that's a possibility. And that's very much in play. And his floor is, what he's always been, which is like 1,200 yards and 3 or 4 touchdowns. His median outcome is somewhere around 8 touchdowns. And that's really, really exciting for where he's being drafted. So DJ Moore is my guy this year. And on top of that, Baker Mayfield, I will also plug, because his issue, like I said, or his thing is that he's always been at worst like a mediocre per attempt quarterback.
Yeah.
The Carolina Panthers have been a mid-tier passing team for the past 2 years since these coaches took over, with quarterbacks they absolutely despise. They got rid of Teddy Bridgewater when he was completely ordinary. They benched Sam Darnold in the middle of a season, and they replaced him with Cam Newton, who's no longer good at throwing the football. So this is a team with poor quarterback play that has still passed the football at a league average rate. If Baker Mayfield is good at football, which he has been with the Cleveland Browns, even though it hasn't shown up on the stat sheet because Cleveland Browns never let him throw the football. So now we're going to pump his attempts to a league average rate with, at minimum league average quarterback play. We're talking about a quarterback that's probably going to pass for 4,000 plus yards and 30 touchdowns. So he's being drafted like quarterback 29 or something like that, which is just completely ridiculous. If he was still with the Browns and he was a starter for the Browns, 29 would be reasonable because the Browns don't let him throw the football. And we have reason to believe that the Carolina Panthers will. So that's a 2 for you get DJ Moore and you get Baker Mayfield, possibly the cheapest, most undervalued stack in all of fantasy football.
Wow. That is a way to put it. I was obviously high on DJ Moore, coming into this, but I didn't realize that I'm still too low on DJ Moore right now and that potential. I didn't realize the touchdown rate was that different between the quarterbacks that he's had since he's been in the league to what he's getting now. And it's not like you're out here saying that Baker Mayfield's a world beater and he's a top 10 quarterback, but he's a huge upgrade compared to what they had comparatively. Another player that is probably about playing with maybe arguably one of the worst quarterbacks of his career, but I think the talent is still crazy, is Brandon Cooks. And I think Brandon Cooks is forever underrated, forever someone that I will always buy. I know you're a Brandon Cooks guy, but he was a top 15 wide receiver last year in points per game with Davis Mills. He was on pace for 163 targets in the games that he played with Mills. Now the Texans have over 50% of their targets inside the 10-yard line up for grabs. And Cooks is still going as around like the wide receiver 25 off the board. I mean, this guy literally beats his ADP every year. And when there's film experts, like arguably the greatest film expert of all time, and Greg Cosell for NFL Film, saying that this Davis Mills guy might be the real deal and like has a lot of potential, that has me really excited when Cooks is getting the target volume. I know the John Mechie thing is happening where he got diagnosed with cancer and he's probably going to miss the season. And I hope he recovers fully, but that opens up even more target competition, or even more targets potentially for Brandon Cooks. So I know you're a Brandon Cooks guy, so I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but do you have anything to add about Brandon Cooks this year, for better or for worse?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. Brandon Cooks is basically a lock to be, 15, 16 fantasy points per game. And his floor is still probably like 14. Like, we're not talking about a player that's going to disappoint you on a per game basis. Sure, he still has the injury concerns, but that's well baked in at his cost. So I think I'm maybe a little more bearish on the Davis Mills outlook than Greg Cosell, but that's probably just because I don't watch football. And I'm not going to be thinking he's a future starting NFL quarterback, but he's a perfectly capable fill-in, like a Gardner Minshew. Like he's that type of quarterback. He could play football, but he's never, in my opinion, going to be a day one starter on purpose after this.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And again, all he needs to be is Gardner Minshew and just be someone that's average and can get him the ball when he needs to. He doesn't need to be a world beater or someone that has otherworldly talent. He just needs to not be, Sam Darnold or Teddy Bridgewater or one of those guys. And I don't think that he is one of those guys. So I'm excited. But on the flip side, we talked about the good stuff and the worry, but what about some of the more negative stuff? Who's one player that you're worried about, or maybe someone that you're lower on than a lot of other people are at this point in the season?
So let's talk about AJ Dillon, because I just tweeted today, literally, that AJ Dillon might be the worst redraft pick in fantasy football right now. And there are some other contenders. Don't get me wrong. I was maybe being a bit facetious by saying he's the worst, but he's a very, very bad redraft pick. And the reason for that is people tend to, like, where he's being drafted is the problem. If he was being drafted like 3-4 rounds later, sure, have him. Like, he's a great bench stash that if things break right, he could have an RB1 season potentially. But where you're having to draft him is like where you're drafting players that don't need some external event to take place in order to pay off. And if you draft AJ Dillon, you can't start him. And you can start him. Don't get me wrong. He scored 10.9 fantasy points per game last year. You could absolutely start him. You could also get 10.9 fantasy points per game by streaming the waiver wire at basically any position you want. So he's completely replacement level if Aaron Jones is in the lineup. So there's no standalone value. That's maybe my biggest pet peeve with the AJ Dillon thing is like, oh, you could draft him and you get some standalone value. You could start him if you need to in your flex and your RB2. And then you could, if Aaron Jones gets hurt, then you have a top 5 running back. And I don't know that we have a top 5 running back. A top 5 running back is a really, really high bar to clear. And I don't know that Aaron Jones AJ Dillon gets there. But my biggest pushback is that you have no floor. The floor of 10.9 fantasy points per game is actually nothing. You could literally go to your waiver wire and get 10.9 fantasy points per game almost every single week. So you do not have a floor. There's no standalone value here. And then go ahead.
Go ahead. Just finish.
And say the other side of it is that if you draft AJ Dillon, you're holding him the whole year. you're not benching or you're not dropping him at any point throughout the entire season. In a redraft league, you usually don't have 20, it's not like Dynasty where you have 20 guys sitting on your bench and it's fine because you got tons of bench room. In a redraft league, you only have like 6-7 spots on the bench in most leagues. So if you're burning one of those spots on a player that you know you're not going to start, or that if you do start isn't going to give you any type of real return on the roster spot, then you're just hamstringing yourself. Conversely, you could take a player that could actually just go out and win you your league straight out of the gate as a, win a job in training camp or be healthy, like literally just exist. And they're going to provide a hell of a lot more value. And what the value that they provide might even be greater than the value that Aaron Jones or AJ Dillon provides if Aaron Jones gets hurt. We don't actually know what AJ Dillon's going to be when Aaron Jones gets hurt because he's only played like 2 games without Aaron Jones in his entire career. We might see, if it's a prolonged injury, we might see another running back step into the AJ Dillon role. And then we have AJ Dillon playing the Aaron Jones role, or we might see another running back step into the Aaron Jones role. And then we still have AJ Dillon at 10.9 points per game. We don't know what's going to happen when the starter gets hurt. That's the downfall. We think we might know what's going to happen, but we don't know what's going to happen. And the player that you might take, that your league mate might take while you're taking AJ Dillon, could simply just score you 15, 16 points per game right out of the gate, and no injuries are required, and they could do it for the whole year. And then you're not wasting a bench spot on a player that you hope might get to be in your starting lineup one day. So AJ Dillon is probably my most disliked, one of my most disliked picks at this point. And I mostly just picked him because the other guy that I usually talk about, I don't really want to talk about anymore.
I hope the other guy isn't Tony Pollard here.
No, the other guy is Gabriel freaking Davis, man.
Okay. All right. But the Tony Pollard thing, before we move on, is do you feel like Tony Pollard is the same argument as AJ Dillon? Or do you think that Tony Pollard you don't hate him as much, or you might like where he's going? Like, a lot of people might feel they're similar because they're both like the running back too. Some people might think they're more talented, maybe not talented, either way. But do you think Tony Pollard, do you view him in the same light you view AJ Dillon?
I view him very similar to AJ Dillon. I think I'd rather have Pollard than Dillon because Pollard is actually probably going to catch passes, which AJ Dillon is probably not going to catch a lot of passes. He had some receiving last year. I think he had about 300 receiving yards, but Tony Pollard could, I think, have a lot more than that.
Okay.
With Ezekiel Elliott on the field.
Yep.
I think at this point, Ezekiel Elliott is probably a lesser running back than Aaron Jones.
Agreed.
And is probably a little bit, I don't know how to word it, but I think he's less locked into his workload than Aaron Jones is to his, if that makes sense.
Yep, that totally makes sense. But do you still think that Pollard is a bad value right now where he's going in drafts around like running back 26 or 27? I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Because if I'm going to draft a player in that range, I want somebody that can just simply give me 16 points a game. Like, obviously, they're not all going to. Don't get me wrong. We're not drafting a bunch of 16 points per game players, but there's going to be 2 or 3 guys in those rounds that score 16 points per game, and it's not going to be AJ Dillon, and it's not going to be Tony Pollard, short of an injury to the starter.
Yeah, I agree. The guy for me that I'm a little bit worried about, and I know that I'm going to catch flack for this one because every time I've ever brought this up over the last 3 years, I catch flack for it, but it's Nick Chubb. Like, I love Nick Chubb, the player. I love Nick Chubb, the talent, but his best finish ever in PPR was the running back 8. And he's playing with the best handcuff in the entire NFL in Kareem Hunt. And then on top of that, it seems like there's a real chance that Jacoby Brissett might be the starting quarterback for all 16 or 17 games this year, when this offense already last year was only averaging 20 points a game. I love Nick Chubb. He's a great player, but when you're drafting this guy at the end of the first or early second or even mid-second round of your draft, like, he is not someone that's going to win you your league. When you're drafting other guys in that same range that literally have the same exact floor, or not same exact, but a similar floor to what Nick Chubb does, but a lack of upside. But there's other thing, there are people out there that are like, well, if Kareem Hunt gets hurt, then all of a sudden Nick Chubb is a top 3 running back in fantasy football. Like, no, still not. Like, they're going to play Dearness Johnson if they don't trade him. Like, every time that there's been an opportunity to give Nick Chubb the workload, they just don't want to do it. Is Nick Chubb arguably the most talented running back in the entire National Football League? Yes. But from a fantasy football perspective, this guy just does not have the top 5 ceiling that he absolutely deserves to. And for that reason, he's someone I'm worried about because, to me, the only way is down. I know that he has a high floor every year, and that's wonderful. But when you're competing with anywhere from 9 to 15 other people in your fantasy football drafts, that's not going to increase your chances of winning. The players that are going to increase your chances of winning is drafting someone like Saquon Barkley going after him that actually has the running back 1 overall in his range of outcomes, where Nick Chubb just does not. So please tell me you agree on Nick Chubb. Again, the talent is there, just not in our fantasy football world and the way their coaches operate.
I would like to read you the blurb from the Bulletproof Fantasy Football Patreon rankings. And it specifically states, has there been anybody more consistently overrated for fantasy than Nick Chubb? He's never going to be a difference maker. Has always been priced like a true difference maker. You simply must sell him because the Browns refuse to love him. And if they don't love him, then why should we? That is my thoughts on Nick Chubb. That is the blurb. It's been there for months now. It's been like that since Nick Chubb basically entered the NFL. He's always been overrated. Every single year, people talk themselves into, but if only he had more work, except it's not coming because they've never given it to him. Like, they've had repeated opportunities to let him spread his wings, and they refuse to do it. So I just would never buy into that at this point. Like you said, I want a player that has RB1 overall upside in his price range, and there are several going in and around where he's being drafted.
No, I completely agree. I love that. On the other side of things, not the other side. We've already talked about the good side, the bad side. Let's go down instead of left or right. Let's just go straight down to some of these late rounds. Are there any late round players in particular that you're really high on for this year that you think people are undervaluing or underrating at this point?
Yeah. Well, I don't. What constitutes late round? Can I say Michael Thomas? Is that an option?
You could say Michael Thomas.
All right, I'm going to say Michael Thomas is just completely disrespected. There is nobody going in his range of the draft that literally just he has to get on the field and he's the wide receiver 1 overall. That's Michael Thomas. Like, the only argument for him is that he's going to get hurt, which is like fair. I get it. But like 9 out of 10 guys and where you're drafting Mike Thomas are not going to have a difference making season. All he has to do is get back on the field, and he's immediately a top 5 or a contender for a top 5 season with wide receiver 1 overall, well within the range of outcomes. I can't believe that he is being drafted as low as he is, given the fact that most guys bust. And if they don't bust, they don't provide any meaningful fantasy value anyways. You can probably replace them with a couple of guys off waivers, like slotting them in a given week, and replace the other guys in his draft range. You can't do that with him. The only player in his draft range that has break fantasy potential is him. And people don't treat him like that. He should probably be being drafted well ahead of someone like AJ Dillon, and he's going well behind AJ Dillon.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. Are there any other players off the top of your head that you think are guys that are just being, that you're overweight to on the field of where they're going right now?
Another guy that I really like, well, I've already kind of touched on him, which is a bit like cheating at this point, but Baker Mayfield is obviously wildly underrated at this point. He is, how do I word it? He's stinky. People are just burned by him, and I get it, except for the whole fact that he's not in that situation anymore. And you just have to let go of what happened in the past because it doesn't matter anymore. He is now a full-fledged Carolina Panther, and they're going to likely give him the volume that will make him score fantasy points. It's really, really hard to score fantasy points as a throwing quarterback when you throw the ball 30 times a game. That's like a recipe for disaster. Now that he's playing for a team that isn't going to throw 30 times a game, he's going to score, 17, 18 points probably at median, with a upper range of 20 fantasy points per game and a lower range of 16. And he's being drafted at, like I said, quarterback 28, I think it was. So Baker Mayfield's another guy that I really like late in drafts. And then the other one that I will throw out is Julio Jones, who just recently signed with Tampa Bay. Julio Jones, I have been telling the patrons, you need to let Julio Jones retire on your bench. I don't care anymore. His cost is irrelevant. I don't care what the risk is. The upside is top 5 wide receiver. That's the upside. We know that he has top 5 wide receiver upside because he's done it pretty much every single year of his career. Will he be a top 5 wide receiver? Probably not, but it's in his range of outcomes. And there's nobody worth like a 3rd round pick in Dynasty that has that in their range of outcomes. like projectable range of outcomes. And then he signs with Tampa Bay, and I'm like, this is like one of the best landing spots you could find. Chris Godwin's coming off an ACL tear. He's very, very unlikely to be really, really good this year. Russell Gage is just completely irrelevant. I can't even fathom people actually like touting Russell Gage even before the Julio signing. It's just insane to me. And then Mike Evans has been like, 17% target share guy for the last 2 or 3 years and has still been a top 10 wide receiver every year. Julio Jones doesn't need to be a 30% target share maniac like he was with the Falcons. He just needs to be a player in this offense like Mike Evans and like Antonio Brown and like Chris Godwin. They're all 20% players. That's perfectly normal for Julio Jones to have. Yes, he might get hurt. Absolutely. He got hurt the last 2 years, but if he doesn't get hurt, and he's not going to be hurt the whole year likely, he's probably going to play some games. And in those games, you can just go ahead and start him in your lineup, and he's probably going to score you 16 points a game at minimum. So,
wow. I don't know about 16 at minimum, but I remember you touting Antonio Brown the same way. And I know that he's a different player when he went to Tampa, but a lot of people weren't in on him, and you were very in on him, and I was in on him, and it definitely worked out. So I love the Julio Jones pick here. And I think the other part of it that you can also look at in this Tampa Bay offense with Tom Brady is that, pretty much every player that's, had a starting role at some point in this offense has produced. Like whether it was even Ronald Jones or Keyshawn Vaughn, all the way to the receivers like Cyril Grayson that were looking like all-stars when, they got significant amount of targets. So it seems like any player that's playing in this Buccaneers offense is going to succeed. And I think Julio Jones, like you said, has immense upside where he's going in drafts. And the thing is, like you said, is, if he's just like a washed Julio that isn't good, which I don't think he is, like, okay, see you later. But like he literally has a massive range of outcomes, and he is one Chris Godwin ACL setback away from probably being a lock to be like a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy football. So I went with you. I absolutely love Julio Jones. That's a great one. One for me, more just because of his usage. I know that you're probably not going to love the player as much, but it's KJ Osborne for me. I know KJ Osborne does not make anybody go jumping up and down and smiling and waving, but KJ Osborne's usage is just going to go up so much this year already. And the main part is that last year, I think KJ Osborne was 32nd in the NFL in routes run, and Van Jefferson was 16th, like last year. So this new offense with Kevin O'Connell that he's bringing to Minnesota is perfect for someone like KJ Osborne that'll be on the field way more in 3 wide receiver sets, which they ran at the highest rate in the league last year with the Rams, and I expect them to do similarly this year in Minnesota. Justin Jefferson himself, so this team is going to pass a lot more. Adam Thielen is 33 and coming off an ankle surgery. And I love Adam Thielen. He's a great player, but this opens up a lot of potential for someone like KJ Osborne, who's also going into his 3rd year. He made a jump from year 1 to year 2. I think he'll make a jump from year 2 to year 3. Don't believe me, believe Patrick Peterson, the cornerback that he goes against every single day, that recently on his podcast said that they asked, who's the breakout player in the Vikings this year? He said KJ Osborne. He said, I think he's a lock for 1,000+ yards. Does that mean he's going to do it? Absolutely not. Is he hyping up his teammate? Yes. But he was also asked, who is that guy that's going to take a big step? And the answer for him was KJ Osborne. So I think a lot of things are pointing for him to be a value. And right now he's going outside the top 50 wide receivers in drafts. And I think that he's someone that is going to beat ADP. Doesn't mean he doesn't have the top 5 in his range of outcomes like someone like Julio Jones, like you said, Drew, but I think he's someone that's going to beat ADP in late in rounds. I think that's a guy that's tied to a good offense that can get a lot of targets and that's going to be on the field a ton this year. Are you in on KJ Osborne, or is he irrelevant because he was a bust in the Bulletproof process?
So I infamously have not ranked KJ Osborne in the Dynasty rankings, simply just because he got missed, and then I just didn't care because he's completely irrelevant. So I'm sorry that you like him.
I knew that was coming.
We're talking about the guy who is battling for the 4th or 5th target, like to be 4th or 5th in line on the Vikings in targets. He's just not someone that I'm really excited about. Could it happen? Of course it could happen, but he was a literal 0 in his rookie year. He had 655 receiving yards in his 2nd year. Adam Thielen, while he is very old and coming off injury, is probably still going to get more targets than KJ Osborne. Justin Jefferson is probably going to be a 30% target share guy for the rest of his life. So there's just not a whole lot. And then we have the tight ends like Irv Smith. He was a 2nd round pick a couple of years ago. Will he be any good? I doubt it, but it could happen. I wouldn't feel any better about KJ Osborne than I would Irv Smith. Would be my kind of rationale around that. And Irv Smith is probably, where is he going in ADP compared to KJ Osborne? Like, they can't be far apart.
Irv Smith, they're going. I think they're going right around the same range.
Yeah, I'd rather just take the tight end then, because he might actually get in my starting lineup. That being said, yeah, he had an impressive year last year. Like, all things considered, he was kind of came out of nowhere. Well, he literally came out of nowhere. He never had a single target as a rookie. So he was a complete unknown that kind of forced his way into the lineup. So we'll see, I guess. But I'm not going out of my way to draft him. He's probably never going to have an impact on winning or losing your fantasy league. And I bet there's other players in his ADP range, though I don't know redraft ADP that well, so I don't know who's going around there.
That's fair. I think for me, outside the top 50 wide receivers, I'm willing to take a guy that is almost a lock to be top 20 in the NFL in routes run next year. Whether the volume or the talent is there, that is maybe neither here nor there. But again, when he's going to run as many routes as almost anybody in the league, he's someone that I'm willing to at least take a flyer on. But I think you made a lot of really great points there, and those are all very valid arguments. Let's move on to some very interesting prospects. This part of the episode.
Let's not move on yet.
Sure.
He's going at 232 in ADP. So if you want to take KJ Osborne at 232, I'm in. That's really, really low.
That's what I'm saying. I'm glad we've converted you now.
I'm back in. Let's go.
The KJ Osborne truther. We're going to get you a T-shirt, a jersey, and maybe a foam finger by the time the Vikings come on Sunday in early September. But now we can move on, correct?
We can move on.
Two running backs that I really, really want to get your thoughts on. These are players that I'm sky high on. Oh, the later reference to foreshadowing of another player we're going to talk about. But running backs, Travis Etienne and Javonte Williams. They're two of my favorite running backs for this season, two players that I'm very in on. But your process has been as accurate as any process that you can find out there in determining which running backs are really good players and which running backs are not so good players. We had a couple disagreements last year that you were right on, so I figured I would ask you about guys like these. How do you feel? We'll start with Javonte Williams. He's going a little bit higher in ADP this year. He had the highest broken tackle rate of any running back since 2006, the highest broken tackle rate in PFF history as a rookie. They dropped Melvin Gordon's salary by 70%. I know Melvin Gordon is still a good player, but whispers have been coming out of this camp that it may be the Javonte Williams show this year, as good as Melvin Gordon is. Do you think we could see something similar to Jonathan Taylor last year and, where he eventually just really takes the workload and runs, maybe not to the running back one overall, but just takes a much more significant share of the workload because of how talented he is and a better offense and a better player going into his second year in the league? How do you feel about Javonte Williams?
Javonte Williams, I think, is really, really, really good at football. He was my running back one in last year's class. I felt like he was going to truly ascend in his second year. Melvin Gordon's contract was up. I didn't foresee them bringing him back. That was a major oversight on my part because that kind of ruins everything. And now we're probably looking at some kind of committee. I can't imagine Javonte is going to get an 80% workload. That's pretty rare anyway. But if we were talking about top 5 upside, that's kind of what we'd be asking for. Is he going to get a 70% workload? I doubt that as well. I think something closer to 60-40. Last year it was 50-50. In a 60-40 workload, I think Javonte Williams is still maybe like a, he might crest the RB12 overall kind of scoring range. He's being drafted at RB11. So I don't feel great about his ADP right now. I do think he's very good. There are a number of players that are going after him that I would much rather have than him, which is not a good sign if we're talking about buying him in redraft. Players such as Aaron Jones, Leonard Fournette, Saquon Barkley are all going in the next 3 or 4 picks. I'd much rather have all 3 of those guys because I think they all have RB1 overall in their range of outcomes straight out of the gate without a Melvin Gordon injury, without an injury, whereas Javonte Williams needs a Melvin Gordon injury to reach that kind of heights. I think. That being said, Melvin Gordon's 28 years old. He could be completely dust this year. We don't really know until we get into the season. But based on last year, I would say he's probably not dust. So yeah. I'm kind of, what would be the word? Bringing back my expectation in 2022. I still like him in Dynasty because you just can't simply get really, really good running backs in Dynasty. So I think you should probably hold him or potentially sell depending on what his price is in Dynasty right now. But I'm pretty sure he's in like a holdable range. But in redraft, I'm probably passing on him for the Aaron Jones, Leonard Fournette, Saquon Barkley trio.
Okay. All right, that's a good way to put it. I don't know. I feel sold a little bit more on his talent. I think you made a lot of great points there, but I think the biggest thing that was crazy for me, and maybe this is shame on me for looking at finishes rather than points per game, but I mean he was the running back 17 overall in fantasy football last year in PPR leagues for a guy that doesn't catch passes according to some people, and he was the running back 17 while never playing more than 60% of the snaps, and besides that one start. And in every game that Melvin Gordon played at least 40% of the snaps. So if that even shifts, another 10%, each way where he gets more work, he improves, this offense scores more touchdowns, I think the upside is unlimited. And I don't know, I feel maybe I just feel burned by Jonathan Taylor last year where I was fading him for the exact same reason with probably less competition. And I just, at this point, I'm like, I don't want to miss twice on something that feels like a similar archetype. Granted, Melvin Gordon is way better than Nyheim Hines and Marlon Mack competition, but I'm willing to buy Javonte Williams at price. I'm not super high over consensus, but I like him where he's going. But I like what you said, though, about these other players that have a higher range of outcomes or a clearer path to being a top 5 running back next year. What about on the other side of Travis Etienne, though, that I mentioned? Travis Etienne, I think, is one of your higher-rated prospects. I know he's not the running back one of last year's class with Javonte Williams, but how are you feeling about Travis Etienne this year and his role potentially in this Jaguars offense where, Trevor Lawrence was the leader in the NFL in checkdowns last year, which definitely favors a player like Etienne.
Yeah, so if we throw ADP out the window and you say, who would I rather have, Travis Etienne or Javonte Williams? I'd rather have Travis Etienne at this point in redraft, not necessarily in Dynasty, because I think we know, like beyond a shadow of a doubt, Javonte Williams is a really high quality running back in the NFL. Yep. We don't know that about Travis Etienne, but Travis Etienne range of outcomes this year is much, much higher. He doesn't need an injury to someone else. He could just simply win his job outright in camp and dominate the NFL. So I really like Travis Etienne this year. Honestly, I really like all the Jaguars. I think that the Jaguars are being slept on a little bit because they're kind of a island of mismatched toys. Like we have Christian Kirk, who was a really good prospect, had a really good rookie year, and then kind of got swallowed up in Arizona. We have Evan Ingram, who was like basically on a Hall of Fame pace for his first 3 or 4 years. And then we have Trevor Lawrence, who had a historically poor rookie year. And I think throwing them all together is like, I don't know if this is going to be a good offense, but I think it probably is going to be a fairly good offense because I think it's completely normal for Evan Ingram to have tanked as the New York Giants offense tanked. Like the entire offense went down the drain at the same time. He was a part of it for sure. But if you look prior to the last year, Evan Ingram was a pretty damn good fantasy football player, scoring, I think he had a top 4 and top 7 finish in his first couple of years, like in points per game. So really, really quite high. And then Christian Kirk is a former 24.5% target share player. He's not a bad wide receiver. He's scored 2 top 36 seasons thus far as like a third bit player in his own offense because, I mean, DeAndre Hopkins is freaking good at football. Like we can't expect Christian Kirk to go out there and score and garner 24.5% of that offense because that player is just really, really good. Christian Kirk probably underperformed what I would have liked to him have done in Carolina or in with the Cardinals the last couple of years. But I think it's possible that he goes out and has a low 20% target share, which is going to give him a reasonable chance at a top 24 season. And if Trevor Lawrence is truly the GOAT, I'm not worried at all about his rookie year because quarterbacks that are rookies suck. Like they just do. A lot of them are terrible. And if you put them into terrible situations, they're going to be even worse. And that's what happened to all of these quarterbacks from last year's class. They all went into these situations that were just atrocious. Like Justin Fields with Darnell Mooney and Cole Kmet as his top 2 targets. Like Allen Robinson was there, but Allen Robinson wasn't the Allen Robinson of old last year. He was basically just checked out, it looked like. Like he he was not involved in the offense, which is really bizarre because on a per route basis, he still scored really well in reception perception. And that doesn't really make sense. So it was like they just phased him out. Probably, I don't know why. It's, we could speculate that he was on the tag and he didn't want to be on the tag and this caused all this friction. And then they were just like, you know what, just get out of here. Like, we don't want you anymore. But they couldn't cut him because you don't do that in the NFL. But I don't really know what happened with Allen Robinson. He wasn't himself, that's for sure. So Justin Fields got into the situation, terrible O-line. He was constantly pressured, blah, blah, blah. Trevor Lawrence got in the same situation. His leading receivers were really, really bad last year. It was awful. His coach was terrible. His offensive line was terrible. Everything was terrible at that situation. They've basically upgraded across the board. I think things are looking up for him. And when you compare his, kept clean performance versus other players kept clean performance, other quarterbacks kept clean performance, it wasn't that bad. He was like a league average rookie quarterback in a kept clean perspective with absolutely atrocious weapons across the board. So I think we're going to see a big jump from Trevor Lawrence, and we're going to see a bounce back from all these players, this island of misfit toys. And Travis Etienne is going to be excellent in a very good offense. Well, let me step it back. It's not going to be a very good offense, a league average offense, which is going to be a giant improvement from the dumpster fire that they were last year. So I'm in on Travis Etienne, especially at his redraft ADP, which is like, I think he's going like wide receiver 15 or running back like 15 or something like that. He's projected to catch passes. He's been all over the field in training camp already. Let me just check he's being drafted RB22. That's insane. This is criminal, absolutely criminal. Draft Travis Etienne and redraft this year. And if his foot injury from last year is still causing him problems, just go ahead and drop him.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I love Travis Etienne. I mean, people have heard me say, you haven't heard before, that Travis Etienne is one of 6 running backs to ever earn a 99 grade from Next Gen Stats going into the NFL. The other 5 were Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, Melvin Gordon, Nick Chubb, and Breece Hall. Beyond that, there have been 10 running backs to play in the NFL so far with a 90-plus grade, let alone a 99. All 10 of those running backs have hit a top 12 fantasy football season at some point. Travis Etienne, again, would be a historical outlier if he did not produce. I mean, he led the NCAA in broken tackles over 2019 and 2020. He's one of the highest yards per route run of all time in college. That translates extremely well to that he not only played with Trevor Lawrence, but Trevor Lawrence had the highest check down rate in the NFL. And what does Travis Etienne do well? He catches passes. And they've also said they want to use him all over the field. And in training camp so far, he's been lining up out wide. He's been lining up in the backfield. They're using him all over the field like a weapon. I'm not going to say Debo, but I just did. But they're going to use him all over the field. So I'm all in on Travis Etienne this year, and I'm glad that you also feel like he's going to smash. But let's move on to the wide receiver position. And I think that, one of the big wide receiver debates outside of Gabriel Davis probably starts in Denver with Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton. There's a lot of, feelings about both of these players for better and for worse. So how do you feel about this whole Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy situation? Do you like either player at cost? Do you like one player over another? Like, how do you feel about this overall going into the season?
I think I am substantially higher on Courtland Sutton than I am on Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy profile is exactly like what he's been in the NFL. He's a nice wide receiver 2 in the NFL, not a nice fantasy wide receiver 2, a nice NFL wide receiver 2. He's going to get separation. He's never going to really probably ever be forced the ball in situations where he's not wide open. Courtland Sutton is that kind of guy. He's the guy that can be forced the ball when they need a play. He's going to probably have a high contested catch throw, if that makes sense. Like, he's going to be throwing a lot of contested catches, partly because he's not as good a separation as Jerry Jeudy is, but also partly because they're just going to go to him when they need to. He's a former 26% target share guy in his second year in the NFL. Last year, he was coming off an ACL injury that is, very known that players need 2 years back from ACL injuries before they're normal again. So this is his normal year. Throw in some off-field concerns with Jerry Jeudy, and I'm rolling with Courtland Sutton. He's got the higher ceiling. They probably got similar floors, and it's a pretty easy choice for me. In terms of their ADP, they're going pretty close to each other. Wide receiver 23 and 25 or 26 in redraft. I would just push the button on Sutton first anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm completely on Sutton. I mean, this guy literally has a career 38% end zone target share. And, his new QB, Russell Wilson, has been top 2 in end zone pass attempts in 3 of the last 4 years. So that obviously helps Sutton out and favors him very well. But the other thing, once again, going back to my company of football guys, and one of my coworkers, Cecil Lammy, is a beat reporter in Denver. And he, among others, in Denver have reported that Cortland Sutton is Russell Wilson's favorite target. It's not Jerry Jeudy. It's not Albert O. It's not, Tim Patrick. Like, it's Cortland Sutton. Like, that's his guy. Again, second year off an ACL, a great prospect. And I think that we're going to see some big things from Cortland Sutton this year. So I'm really excited to see it. But another player that we might see some big things from this year is Rashad Bateman. Rashad Bateman, I think, had a pretty impressive rookie year. And I'm not sure how you feel about Rashad Bateman, but how do you view Rashad Bateman going into this year now? Because, Hollywood Brown is gone from this Ravens offense. There's a lot of targets that are opened up, and vacated targets, everyone's favorite stat, are flowing. And outside in this wide receiver room, outside of Rashad Bateman, there really isn't anyone else. Yes, Mark Andrews is there, and he's going to hog some targets, but I think that Rashad Bateman has a lot of big potential there. So as a prospect, were you a fan of Rashad Bateman, and how do you view his outlook for this year?
Yeah, I mean, Rashad Bateman was my wide receiver 2 last year. There was really no question about whether or not he was a good prospect. He was as bulletproof as they come. There wasn't a box he didn't check. His rookie year was hit and miss. He had about a 15 or 16% target share, if I recall correctly, maybe 14, somewhere in that 15-ish range. Actually, I think it was 14.7, if I remember correctly. Anyways, he had a fairly mediocre target share, but considering the context of his offense, where he's playing with 2 alphas getting 25% plus target shares, that's not so bad. The vacated targets thing, I think, is completely overblown, because people think that somebody's just going to step in and fill the role that was there before them. Or, oh, look at all these vacated targets, I could have anything. It doesn't work like that necessarily, but there is such a thing as too many mouths to feed. And my theory around this, and I haven't officially gone in and proved it out, it's more just anecdotal at this point, but it's really, really hard to have 3 pass catchers account for 75% of the offense. That's just not going to happen. So if we have 3 wide receivers that are capable of 25% target shares, it's not going to happen. They're not all going to have 25% target shares. Somebody's going to get their lunch eaten, or they're all going to come down. One of the 2 options. So we've seen this a number of different times. LA Rams is probably the best example of teams with 3 really good receivers, and they all just kind of bring each other down a little bit. Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, and Brandon Cooks all were roughly 20 to 22% target share players while they play together. As soon as one of them leaves, they jump to 24, 25%. And then for whatever reason this year, Cooper Kupp went to the moon. It was wild. But anyway, so that's one of the examples where we have 3 quality pass catchers and they all cannibalize each other. Another situation is what we just saw in Cincinnati last year. We have Tyler Boyd putting up, 20 to 26% target shares for the last few years, and then just getting completely annihilated once Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are in town. They were the true alphas with, 23, 24% target shares. And Boyd went from his career norm of 23, 24% all the way down to 18%. So when we look at this Ravens offense last year, and we're looking at Rashad Bateman and being like, well, why was his target share low? He's a rookie playing with 2 alphas. Of course his target share was low. So I'm not that worried about his target share. And then we look at his per route stats and things like that. And his reception perception came out and kind of just changed my entire view of him, because his PFF grade wasn't that good, but PFF grade also factors in some things I think that are volume driven. So players with high volume tend to have a little bit better PFF grades. The only way that you see somebody with a 50 PFF grade is because they got 1 target. Anybody who gets 1 target doesn't get a 90 PFF grade. And maybe that's just, the way that it works, because players that suck only get 1 target. I don't know. But I think his PFF grade was in some way muted by his low target share, because his reception perception was actually excellent. It was in the top 86th percentile and above for versus man, versus zone, and versus pass.
He's top 25% all time in all 3.
Yeah, So like he's very good on a per route basis. Will that translate to now playing against better cornerbacks and better coverage? I don't know. We'll see. I think it will, because when you look at strictly rookies, they're all playing probably not the best coverages. So when he's putting up a top, like I said, 86 percentile and all those stats, that's comparing apples to apples. We're comparing rookies to rookies. So he was a really good rookie on a per route basis, according to reception perception. His prospect profile was really good. His production was muted, I think, because of the presence of Hollywood Brown and Mark Andrews being really good at football and target hogs of themselves. Now Hollywood Brown is gone. Again, I don't view this as a vacated targets argument. I view this as now we have two's company, and two is fine. We are allowed to have two alphas in the same offense. Three is a crowd. We are not allowed to have three. So Marquise Brown leaving isn't necessarily a vacated targets. It opens up another alpha seat. And Rashad Bateman is fully capable of filling that alpha seat. I have looked at all the players that were bulletproof, like Rashad Bateman was as a prospect, and looked at how they did if they only had about a 14% target share, 14.7% target share, plus or negative 2 percentage points. And they all come in around 24%. So I'm expecting Rashad Bateman to come in around 24% target share next year, which is going to be perfectly fine. He's being drafted at wide receiver 37. He's probably going to be a wide receiver 2 next year. So that is a tremendous value.
Yeah, no, I love Bateman. I mean, like we talked about, he beat man, zone, and press coverage each at a top 25% rate of all time. He's on an offense with 45% of their targets up for grabs, including 38% of last year's targets inside the 10. And I mean, this is exactly when he's going to be a good player. Mark Andrews said the sky is the limit for him. So obviously he is going to have a breakout season and hit the sky. But speaking of sky, how about we talk about Sky Moore real quick? Sky Moore is a player that I'm absolutely in love with, for better or for worse, and I'm excited to get your opinion on him. But going back to reception perception, Sky Moore was number 1 among all rookies in beating zone coverage. He's number 2 among all rookies in beating man coverage. He's playing with Patrick Mahomes on an offense with 53% of their targets up for grabs. And I don't think that any of his competition is super intimidating outside of Travis Kelce. I mean, I know Juju's there, and I know the great and almighty Marquez Valdez-Scantling is there to really steal some targets this year, even though he's never gone over a 15% target share in his career. But how do you feel about Sky Moore this year? Do you think he has a lot of potential? He's currently going outside the top 40 wide receivers in an offense with Patrick Mahomes, where he could legitimately be the wide receiver 1. How do you feel?
I feel like Sky Moore is I think he's a tremendous value. I just looked up his ADP on Fantasy Pros in PPR leagues, and it's wide receiver 54, and that's certifiably insane. Sky Moore is – so I did my rankings. I do my rankings every year, like immediately after the draft, within 2 or 3 days, my rookie rankings. And I had Sky Moore at wide receiver 4, I believe, right after Garrett Wilson and Treylon Burks were 2 and 3. And about a month or two, maybe about a month later, I kind of started thinking about it more. And I was like, this is a mistake. This is an absolute mistake. Sky Moore needs to be the wide receiver 2 in this class. He is exactly what we're looking for from a wide receiver prospect. He grades out as bulletproof. He's, drafted in the 2nd round. Like, the dude got the draft capital. He was wildly productive in college. He's slightly undersized, but not like crazy undersized. And he's undersized to a point where all the players are going to be that size pretty soon, other than like Drake London, who is a monster. But like the size criteria that we've historically used is going to have to change, because most of the young players that are getting drafted highly now are much smaller than they used to be. The average size of draft picks is going down tremendously at the wide receiver position, which makes Sky Moore more attractive because his size isn't such a deterrent as it used to be. So then you factor in the fact that he's playing with, Patrick Mahomes, who's pretty good at football.
Solid.
And Travis Kelce's like 31 or 32 now. Like he's getting pretty old. With old players, the bottom falls out like that. It could happen this year for Travis Kelce. We don't know. We don't know until it happens. So if that happens and Juju Smith-Schuster is exactly what he's always been, which is about a 20% target share player, I think it's pretty reasonable, in my opinion, to expect Sky Moore to be a very, very solid producer down the stretch. He's not going to win you your league in the first 10 weeks of the season, But those last 7 or 8 weeks, it could get really exciting for Sky Moore. We know that rookie production scales up as the season progresses, which is why I love rookies in redraft, because they are faded because of their season-long projections are low. But we know that a player like Sky Moore, on average, has about an 18% seasonal target share, like per game for the whole season. But we know that's skewed heavily towards the end of the year, being much higher than the beginning of the year. He's probably going to start around 10, 12% and gradually scale up until we get to about 23% by the end of the year. And if you recall, you win championships at the end of the year. So a player like Sky Moore is extremely, very, very attractive to me in a redraft context and obviously in a dynasty context.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Well, especially when, you said you could get 18%, roughly those targets for the whole season, right? And 18% would be a absolutely ridiculous amount of targets. I'm literally trying to do the math right here as we speak. And the amount of targets you get is over 120 in an offense of Patrick Mahomes. So 120 plus targets at an 18% target share if they kept the same passing rate as last year on an offense that's with Patrick Mahomes and is going to be scoring a lot of points. Again, like you said, he's going outside the top 40 right now, so you have time to hold him and let him kind of develop. It's not like you're drafting him with a top, 30 wide receiver pick right now. So I think that Sky Moore is an excellent pick. But another guy that's, going in the same range roughly, I think he's going even lower than Sky Moore, is someone like Chase Claypool, who I think we saw a lot of potential from in his rookie year. And we saw a little bit of a downturn last year. But do you think that it was more a Big Ben thing, and all of a sudden with the almighty Mason Rudolph or Mitchell Trubisky or Kenny Pickett, that all of a sudden Chase Claypool is going to take the throne once again and show everybody who he really is, especially on fourth down late in games? But Chase Claypool is someone that I think is a little bit of a conundrum, and he's going late and he has talent. But do you think that there's any potential with these quarterbacks this year, or do you think that big slot Claypool is going to be someone that really struggles this year?
I think Chase Claypool, as a player individually, so when he was coming out as a rookie, I had him ranked ahead of consensus, but I had him with a really bad grade. He gets a bus grade from my process because he just didn't really do much in college. But I still had him ranked ahead of consensus because I liked his I liked his size and athleticism, which is such a sellout because I know it doesn't matter, but it's attractive nonetheless. And then he went on and had a really strong rookie year, really, really strong rookie year. And I wasn't that into him because his sophomore comps weren't that good for me. I do this process called sophomore comps where I combine a player's prospect grade and a number of rookie year performance metrics like points per game and PFF grade and their ADP trends. So did they lose or gain ADP after their rookie year? Kind of a wisdom of the crowds type of metric. And Chase Claypool looked real bad. And then what I realized is that I always had done it for bus players for rounds 1 to 3. But really, there's no difference in a bus player drafted in rounds 1 or 7. They're all the same. There are no bus players in round 1, just so you know. Even the worst players in round 1 hit at greater than 11% rate. So they don't get the bus grade. But from rounds 2 to 7, the bus grade is basically the same. There's not a lot of change. It goes from 11.6%, and then in round 7, it's 8.3. So they're pretty much the same. And when I flipped the switch and changed Chase Claypool's sophomore comps from, only round 2 and 3 bus to rounds 2 through 7 bus, it just lit up. Suddenly we had Stephon Diggs on the list. We had Antonio Brown on the list. We had Tyreek Hill on the list. And I was like, I've made a huge mistake. So middle of last year, when I realized this, I started telling the patrons, hey, I know Chase Claypool's not having a good year, but we probably need to be buying Chase Claypool as a post-hype sleeper, because I think he's actually pretty good at football. And I think the reason he's not doing very well is because he's not a superstar and he's playing with a really, really, really bad quarterback right now in Ben Roethlisberger. And as much as Ben Roethlisberger was bad at football last year, he's even worse at throwing football to the areas of the field where Chase Claypool excels. So Chase Claypool basically got the worst of every world. He's not, like I said, he's not a superstar. Let's not get carried away and say he's a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL from a talent perspective. But could he be a top 24 wide receiver at some point in his career? I think that's absolutely reasonable. if Kenny Pickett gets in under center, I am much more concerned about Chase Claypool's outlook this year than I am if Mitchell Trubisky holds onto the job for the whole year. Mitchell Trubisky is not a good quarterback, don't get me wrong, but he's fine. He has the ability to get the ball to Chase Claypool, and that's more than we can say for what I think Kenny Pickett's going to do, especially as a rookie. So then the other side of this coin, though, is I like the rookie better. Yeah. So I'm kind of like, yeah, I could see how this works out for Chase Claypool, but I'd rather just take that shot on George Pickens instead. And Pickens is going, I think, even quite a bit later than Claypool. And if I had to put any bet on a wide receiver in Pittsburgh that isn't Deontay Johnson, whom I love, it would probably be George Pickens at this point, because I think he's probably a better player in general than Chase Claypool is. And again, that same rookie year thing I was just talking about with Sky Moore, George Pickens is also bulletproof. He also has a historical average. Bulletproof wide receivers also, or he qualifies for that same historic average of 18% target share on a per game basis across the entire season that Sky Moore does. So if that holds true, I think I'd rather have George Pickens at a much lower price. And then in Dynasty, yeah, I think he's just a way better player than Chase Claypool. If Deontay Johnson walks, I think it's going to be George Pickens and Chase Claypool, not Chase Claypool and George Pickens, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I feel like, it's going to get sorted out with Deontay Johnson. I think he's too good for them to let go, and I think that's where I kind of stand on Claypool. Is I also am very high on Pickens, and even I don't think Calvin Austin's that great, but they drafted Calvin Austin, George Pickens. They still have Deontay Johnson. They still have Pat Freiermuth, who's not a big target commander, but still another person for competition. So with all that being said, and after what we saw last year from Chase Claypool, I think I'm just a little bit out on him right now for where he is going. But the last thing I want to move on to is our tight ends real quick. The tight ends, I have two questions for you before we get out of here on the tight ends. The first, Dallas Goedert, TJ Hawkinson, Dalton Schultz. All going back to back right now in fantasy football. I think it's going Schultz, Hawkinson, and then Goddard. I said it backwards. Is there any one of those guys? Like, who's the first guy that you take between those three in fantasy football for this season specifically?
I think I'm taking Hawkinson basically just on pedigree. Dallas Goedert is in a rough offense for him. I think he's a pretty good player. Like, I don't think he's a slouch by any stretch. I don't think he's going to be out of the league next year because he's so bad. Nothing like that. But I think Jalen Hurts is probably not an upper tier NFL passer. And I think that's going to limit the pass volume. And then I think that A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith are probably just much higher on the totem pole than he is, which, again, three is company. So one man's either they're all going to eat together the lower rate, or one man's going to get left behind. And I think it's going to be Dallas Goedert getting left behind in this case, because I think Smith and A.J. Brown are just quite a bit better than he is.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm personally, I actually had Goddard written down just because I wanted to bet on the talent more than anything, and I'm a believer in what this offense is going to be. This year I don't think it's going to be as run heavy as we saw last year. So I'm kind of leaning towards Dallas Goedert. He was first in the NFL in yards per route run last year. He was first in the almighty, yards per target stat, but he was second in second in target separation, third in fantasy points per target. But the biggest thing that I liked about Goddard going into next year, although he's not as good of a player, he played at least 90% of the snaps in 6 out of the 7 games after Zach Ertz left. So I think he's going to be on the field a lot. And, maybe the volume isn't there as much because I think A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith are fantastic. But Dallas Goedert's the guy I'm going to go bet on because I think he's the most talented, even if Hawkinson and Schultz probably have an easier path to targets. Last question, tight end related. Evan Ingram, Alberto, Irv Smith. Are there any of those guys that you're confident on at all at the tight end position? Who are you going to take out of those 3 players right now in your fantasy football drafts?
I'm drafting the hell out of Evan Ingram this year because, like I said earlier, I think that Jaguars offense is probably a little bit underrated. I don't think they're going to be the worst offense in football. I think they're probably going to be a mid-tier offense in football, which isn't like, oh my God, they're the best. Like, they're not going to go like the Bengals did where they went from worst to best, but they're going to go from worst to mid-tier. And we go from worst to mid-tier, and Evan Ingram is probably going to get a 20% target share because almost every year of his entire life, he's at a 20% target share. A tight end with a 20% target share is almost guaranteed to be a top 6 tight end. So I'm very into that. Like his cost right now is embarrassingly low. People think that last year is just going to carry on, and I do not think that's the case at all.
Okay.
What is his cost? He's going at 177 in redraft leagues right now. At tight end 20, there is a 0.0% chance that he does not pay off at that ADP. And there's a really good chance that he's going to smash at that ADP.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow.
Earlier you asked me who is my late round player that I'm all over. I've just decided it's Evan Ingram. This is an outrage.
This is an outrage. I love that. Evan Ingram, that's interesting. Because I think everyone right now is trying to identify who that late round, tight end target is. And maybe it's Evan Ingram with the target share, the offense. And also these Doug Peterson offenses have heavily favored the tight end position. He said today he likes tight ends. There's also a beat reporter that I was talking to yesterday. I can't remember her name. I'm so sorry to the listeners for that. But I asked who stood out the most so far in camp. And her first answer was Evan Ingram. She said Evan Ingram and Laquan Treadwell. So take that for what it's worth. It might just be an absolute grain of salt. But when he's had at least a 15% target share or more every year of his career, he's playing in an offense that favors the tight ends with a solid quarterback, and Trevor Lawrence. I think that he is definitely an interesting flyer at the tight end position. If you're not taking Daniel Bellinger, he's the guy that very, very late that I'm definitely going after. But the final question I have for you, I had you plant a flag a couple months ago. Yeah, please.
Hold on. Let's go back to Evan Ingram for a second because I just looked it up because I'm so outraged at this ADP now.
Yeah.
His target shares since entering the NFL have been 20% with a 25.9% target rate, 16.8% with a 24.1 target rate. That's the second year. He was injured a lot that year, left a lot of games early. And then we got 22% with 27. And then we got 1.8 with 22.4. We're talking about a player that basically has only ever been excellent at earning targets in the NFL. Last year, he was terrible with 14.8. I don't really know what happened. The whole offense just basically cratered, and he was clearly not part of the plan anymore. Maybe he sucks, and that's why he no longer got targets. We'll find out this year. But at price tag 177 with a career average target share somewhere in the 20% plus, it's insane not to take him in redraft leagues. Carry on.
You're good. Is that going to be your flag plant for today's episode, or is there another player that you want to plant your flag on that you think is going to be really good this year? Because you've had a pretty good track record with things like this in the past. So, is there any player that we have not talked about today that you feel very strongly about that you think is going to have a really great year that you feel like you might be overweight to the field on?
Yeah. I'll give you one of the players that I think I am definitely overweight on that I think his name is Drake London. You've probably heard of him. He got drafted 8th overall by the Atlanta Falcons. And this is a two-parter because I also think that Marcus Mariota is wildly underrated right now. Marcus Mariota's stats from a per throw basis, much like Baker Mayfield, are NFL starter quality in his entire career. He's never been bad on a per throw basis. He got benched in Tennessee. I get it. That happened. Ryan Tannehill has been freaking incredible since he took over. If that's how Ryan Tannehill was playing in training camp, they should have put Ryan Tannehill in week 1. Marcus Mariota never should have saw the field again. So I don't necessarily hold that against Marcus Mariota because I don't think he's the best quarterback in the NFL by any stretch, but I think he's a serviceable starter in a, probably 16 to 10 in terms of pass skill in the NFL, or at least that's what he has been in Tennessee in his starter days. So when we're talking about this, I'm not really saying, I am saying go and get Marcus Mariota in your super flex leagues because he's really, really free and you should just have him because he's got some Konabi and he's probably not a terrible passer and that's going to score some points. But Drake London, and I think this has been a mistake I've made in the past several times and something I'm trying to correct here and now. I tend to underrate what the superstar wide receivers are going to do as rookies. Jamar Chase last year, I knew was the best wide receiver prospect we'd seen since Calvin Johnson. I thought he was a better prospect than AJ Green. I thought he was a better prospect than Julio Jones. I thought he was a better prospect than every next great prospect we've seen since Calvin Johnson. And yet I did not think he was a tremendous value in redraft leagues, and that was obviously a huge mistake. What I have noticed now that I have been, one of the things I've been changing this year is I've been trying to look at, how do I word it? Target share trends. So how can we better project young players' target shares? And one of the ways that I do that is by now having all of their target shares in my database from their rookie years. So I can see, based on these criteria, what do the players that are like this have for target shares? Drake London, his group is probably going to have a season-long per game percentage target share somewhere in the low 20s, which means his end of season is probably going to be in that alpha range with a 25% plus target share in his rookie year. So again, fantasy football championships are won in the playoffs of the fantasy football league. Drake London's going to be an alpha at that point of the season, and you need to have him on your roster. And you need to have him in Dynasty because he's going to be freaking incredible for the next several years. You need to have him in redraft because he's not being priced like he's going to win you your championship in the playoffs, and he's going to be a serviceable player all year. He's probably going to be a wide receiver 2 in the whole season. So like when we factor in his, slow start, he's going to have a slow start. He's not going to come out and score 16 fantasy points per game in week 1, but he's going to score 16 fantasy points, or he's going to score 16 fantasy points per game the last half of the year, because that's how rookies progress. So Drake London is someone that I would like to plant my flag on in a redraft context, which is something I've never really done before. I've always been a little bit gun shy with projecting rookies for substantial work, but now having the ability to look at every single rookie and how their target shares have worked throughout their entire career, starting with their rookie year, I'm in.
Wow. You heard it here. You heard it here first. Sorry, you heard it here first, folks. Drew thinks that Drake London is going to have a better rookie year than Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase combined.
Combined. He's going for 2,800 yards this year.
You're saying you think he's going to have a better year than Bryan Edwards himself.
I do think that he might find a way to score a couple more fantasy points than Bryan Edwards this year.
Somewhere deep in his bag. But
I would like to caveat that there's a good chance that Bryan Edwards, the 2-minute drill king, will outscore Drake London in the 2-minute drill.
I agree. I absolutely love that. But Drew, it's been phenomenal having you on the show today. I think that is a wonderful place to close out. Before we go, you have a Patreon. You have a lot of other great stuff you're working on. So please tell the people where they can find all your amazing work, stats, and that Canadian accent that we can never get enough of. So with that being said, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so you can find me on Facebook at DF Bean Counter, and then you can follow me or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/bulletproofff. That is where I do basically all of my analysis now. So join me.
I love that. But Drew, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. As always, you are always one of my favorite guests to have. I don't think I laugh as much with you as I do almost anybody else, but your bulletproof analysis is second to none. So with that being said, I appreciate you. And I appreciate you, Fresh Fantasy listeners, for tuning into all these episodes. It's been an absolute blast and pleasure to keep creating episodes, and we're heading towards season, and I cannot wait to do it. But as always, you guys already know, please leave that review. You guys already know what to do, and I hope you all have a great rest of your